Japan wanted to hide their loss at the Battle of Midway, and the biggest threat to this secret were the battle's survivors. So, to keep them quiet, they came up with a diabolically cruel plan. While everyone knows about Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, there's another World War II battle that was just as dramatic, the Battle of Midway, where America attempted to both hold their ground in the volatile Pacific and get revenge for what happened at Pearl Harbor. Way back in 1859, Captain N.C. Brooks claimed the Midway Islands for the United States of America. The thing was, America had little use for the atoll, which covers 6.2 square kilometres. When air travel became common, the Midway Islands, named so because they're roughly in between North America and Asia, were suddenly an asset worth defending. In 1940, the US Navy started to build bases for both submarines and air traffic, along with radio facilities and a power plant. It was hard to keep all this activity a secret. Soon, the Japanese noticed. Over the 2-day period of December 7th and 8th, 1941, just 12 hours following their attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan also struck the hangar and the power plant on Midway. In 1942, Japan had a plan to expand the war to the Pacific. They set their sights on British Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, British Malaysia, and the Dutch East Indies. In April, American forces hit targets in Tokyo and other cities in Japan. The Japanese knew that the US was a formidable enemy, and that their presence in the Pacific posed a serious threat to Japan's defences. At this point, the Japanese seriously considered hitting Pearl Harbor again. The first attack had drawn the US into the war. Japan initially hoped that a second offensive would force the US to pull back its defences. Instead, they came up with a different plan. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto chose the Midway Atoll for his next move. Despite not being of particular importance to the Japanese, they knew the tiny islands were vital for the Americans to refuel their submarines. Yamamoto wanted to act fast. He'd already destroyed the USS Yorktown in the Battle of the Coral Sea. This meant the Americans only had the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet left for defence. This information suggested that the US was vulnerable, but there was something that Yamamoto didn't know. The USS Yorktown had been hit and needed repairs, but the Americans had worked around the clock and made it seaworthy in 72 hours. It was a remarkable feat, and the USS Yorktown was ready to go. The US was not a vulnerable target, at least not as vulnerable as Yamamoto thought. But there was something else that he got wrong. Because of US losses in the region, Yamamoto assumed that morale on the US side was low, but he underestimated the American desire to succeed. Morale wasn't low, and American fighters were ready to take on whatever Japan had in store for them. Yamamoto's plan was to lure any American carriers into Midway by sending a small showing of force led by Chuichi Nagumo. His secret plan was to have more fighting power several hundred miles behind the first wave, led by Nagumo himself. What Yamamoto didn't count on was American codebreakers. The codebreakers knew that the Japanese were referring to a location by the code AF. They suspected it meant Midway, but they weren't sure. They sent an uncoded message saying that Midway's water purification system wasn't working. The Japanese relayed this information, replacing Midway with AF. Now the Americans were certain that AF meant Midway. This was critical information. The US now had a vague plan of what was in store for them at the Battle of Midway. They knew what to expect, and Yamamoto had no idea they knew anything at all. Admiral Chester Nimitz sent 3 carriers to a northeast position off Midway. The carriers were Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese didn't know that the Yorktown was still in one piece. By June 4th, the US Navy had assembled a formidable defence. They had 4 squadrons of seaplanes totalling 31 aircraft, Grumman TBF Avengers 6 in total. The Marine Corps added 64 more planes and the US AAF added another 122. The US was much more prepared than the Japanese could have imagined. By 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, Nagamo was ready to launch his attack. Major Floyd B. Parks led the American interception, but he quickly suffered some heavy losses. Following the battle, only 2 of the US planes were left still able to fly, but the American anti-aircraft force was lethal. They destroyed 3 Japanese aircraft and did significant damage to the others. Next, the US would benefit from a Japanese tactical error. Nagamo had to decide whether to finish rearming or attack immediately. He decided to wait, and many believe this was his fatal mistake. Suddenly, the Americans had a huge advantage. The Enterprise, Hornet, and the USS Yorktown were now all in the area of the Battle of Midway. The plan was to use 2 squadrons to make direct hits on 3 Japanese carriers in the area. Unfortunately, it was now the Americans' turn to make a devastating mistake. Due to a miscommunication, both US squadrons attacked the same carrier, the Kaga. The Kaga ended up receiving a double strike, killing the captain and many of his senior officers. The Kaga was down, but the other Japanese carriers remained untouched. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best noticed the error while he and his wingmen still had time to pull out of their dives. They made a stunning change of plan. They quickly changed direction to launch an attack on one of the other Japanese ships, the Akagi. While they only succeeded in making one direct hit, it was a lethal one. The explosion struck the aircraft on the upper hangar deck. The Japanese had armed and fueled these aircraft, and the result was a massive fire. One man on board said there were bodies everywhere. The Akagi was destroyed, but there was still one carrier left for the Americans to deal with. Lieutenant Max Leslie took off from the USS Yorktown in a VB-3. His mission was to take down the Soryu. His 3 hits ignited fuel and caused huge explosions, which turned into a powerful and lethal inferno. Now all 3 carriers were ablaze. Eventually the blaze became unstoppable, and Nagamo had to leave the Akagi in shame. At that point, Japan's only surviving carrier was the Hiryu, which could still inflict damage on the Americans. The Hiryu struck the USS Yorktown, severely damaging it. Once again, the Japanese thought they'd crippled the Yorktown, but the Americans were once again able to repair it quickly. The repairs were so successful that the Japanese thought they were dealing with a different carrier when they encountered the Yorktown again. They hit it once more, and this time the damage was severe. The Japanese were celebrating the destruction of 2 carriers, but they were wrong. This gave them a false sense of being close to victory. In the latter part of the day on June 4th, a scout plane from the Yorktown made an amazing discovery. They'd found the location of Japan's last remaining carrier, the Hiryu. With this information, the USS Enterprise sent an attack. By the time the day was over, the Hiryu was in flames and eventually sank. But the Battle of Midway was far from over. The sun set on this bloody day, leaving the area plunged in darkness. The 2 sides took the time to plan their next moves. Just after 2 a.m. on June 5th, Commander John Murphy, who was aboard a submarine called Tamber and just west of Midway, saw several ships approaching, but had no way of knowing if they were friendly forces or the enemy. This confusion was going to cost America. Commander Robert English received Murphy's report about the ships and became enraged because the report didn't identify whether they were Japanese. As it turned out, they were the ships that Yamamoto had sent, and they were on their way to attack Midway. But something strange happened. The ships Mogami and Mikuma accidentally crashed into each other. This meant they were now sitting ducks. Murphy could now see that the approaching ships were Japanese, and this led him to take his submarine down, both to hide and to launch an offensive strike. Unfortunately, his ambush didn't go well, and he snuck away from the area without any hits. The two slow-moving cruisers were still extremely vulnerable, but there was no American vessel there to take advantage. Murphy arrived back at port and had to face the music. His first sin was that he'd sent a vague report about the cruisers. His second was not being more aggressive in his attack. The ships were an easy target, and he'd failed to do any damage. Murphy's punishment was a demotion. To fix the damage done by Murphy, the Americans launched strikes from both Midway and their carriers. They sank the Mikuma, and the Mogami suffered significant damage. They also did serious damage to two other destroyers. Captain Richard E. Fleming was killed in this offensive. He received a posthumous Medal of Honor for his service. But there was little time to mourn. The Battle of Midway raged on. The USS Vireo was towing a heavily damaged Yorktown. The USS Hamon wasn't so lucky. It was also struck by a Japanese torpedo. The entire ship broke in two pieces and began to sink. To make matters worse, the Hamon's own depth charges ignited. 80 men lost their lives. The Yorktown had always been able to make a recovery, but this time it seemed impossible. The remaining crew abandoned the ship. At around 7 a.m, it turned over and went down to the watery depths. The Yorktown was no more. The following days saw the US send more forces to deal with the Japanese. They were able to send fighters from both the sea and from Midway. With this lethal force, Japan had to slowly retreat. It looked like the Americans had won the Battle of Midway, but there were also some grim realities to face. On the American side, the casualty list included the Yorktown and the Hamon. 307 servicemen lost their lives, including Major General Clarence L. Tinker, who was a commander of the 7th Air Force. For the Japanese, the toll was far more devastating. The Battle of Midway had cost them 3,057 lives. Two Japanese captains had both died as they valiantly went down with their ships. Of course, they also suffered the loss of carriers and countless aircraft. Even though it was clear that the Americans had come out on top, the news in Japan was different. In fact, they announced a great victory. The true nature of the brutal loss remained a secret. Only Emperor Hirohito and his highest officials knew the truth. But keeping this secret was going to be difficult. When the casualties of the Battle of Midway arrived in Japan, it would soon become clear that the Japanese had been defeated. To keep their secret alive, they kept the Midway casualties away from other patients at the hospital. The survivors also had to be silenced, so they were sent to other battles in the Pacific, where most of them were killed. Of course, the truth was out there, but a lot of it was sitting at the bottom of the ocean. The waters around where the Battle of Midway took place are extremely deep, so locating the destroyed vessels proved difficult. In 1998, oceanographer Robert Ballard used the help of veterans, both American and Japanese, to locate the sunken Yorktown. Remarkably, photographs show a mostly intact ship. Ballard couldn't find any remains of the Japanese carriers. Many see the Battle of Midway as a very significant change in World War II. It was a turning point in that this was the first naval win for the Allies against the Japanese. Many historians speculate about what would have happened if the Japanese had won at Midway. It's possible that they had plans to occupy Fiji and Samoa, and even carry out offensives against Australia and Alaska. If the Battle of Midway had ended differently, the world may have been a very different place. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. If you enjoyed this video, check out the others on screen, for more amazing history content.